Jimmy Wormworth was born on August 14, 1937 in Utica, New York. His mother, Anne Mariani, and his father, James Wormworth, were briefly married and divorced when he was just 2 years of age.
They were together only 2 years, and they lived with my maternal grandparents, my mother's parents, and brothers and sisters, my aunts and uncles. My father came from a well-to-do family, and my mother's parents were upper middle class in Italy, but were just plain immigrants here. They got married. Now, I don't know if my mother was pregnant with me first or not. She was the second oldest sibling of about 6 or 7 during the Depression, so she had a lot of grown-up responsibilities, but so she dropped out of school after the 3rd grade. But my Aunt Mary told me that my mother read every book that was in the neighborhood library. She spoke fluent Italian, completely fluent, and she was her own person. My father was overprivileged coming from the black community. His parents were the highest level of black society, as black folks say, 400 folks. And my father was an only child, and in high school, according to my mother and my aunts, he had a brand new convertible. Now that's in the Depression, or in the 20s. And well, I don't know, I guess maybe at first my mother looked at him as being even more than what he actually was. My father was, well, originally a drummer, but I guess he had studied piano too, because he had a pianist technique. He played piano with, maybe my father played piano with Billie Holiday when she and Helen Humes did a lot of work in the central New York State area. Well, I never had much to do with my father because he never had much to do with me. I was always ready to talk to him and hang out with him, but he wasn't interested.
Jimmy grew up in Utica with his younger brother, Joe. The 2 boys were raised by and lived in the same house with their mother, 2 aunts, 3 uncles, and 2 grandparents. The family ran the local concession at Utica's McConnell Field ballpark. Jimmy's father was not involved in the boys' upbringing.
But my mother, she lived for my brother and me. She never married again. She just pretty much devoted herself to the family, and the family was together through all my childhood. Her, 2 of her 3 sisters, and 3 of her brothers, and one by one, the rest moved out. Well, one uncle never married, but and I was pretty close to all of them. They were all like parents to me, except I never had no actual father. And I grew up just with my Italian side, my Italian and Italian-American side. My mother and aunts and uncles were first-generation Italian-Americans. The earliest I remember being interested in music was when I heard all these records that my uncle had bought when he came home from the World War II, like in January of '46. And my uncle, the saxophone player, picked out the records. And they included Nellie Lutcher, Art Tatum, a lot of records. I guess not long after that, they decided, well, look, he's got to play, blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, what instrument should he play? My mother, my aunts, that is. Well, his father played the drums, you might as well make him play the drums. My mother enrolled me in a course of our hometown's most preeminent percussionist, who also happened to be a great rudimentalist. He knew all about rudimental drumming, and that's how he taught me. And I whizzed through his courses, and I didn't like to practice, but one of my aunts, who played the heavy, the bad detective, so to speak, she apparently saw to it that I practiced, because I just flew through his course, which was started out simply enough, but then got really, really complicated with some really well-renowned studies read books. And I just flew through that in 2.5 years. And after I finished my snare drum studies, my teacher, his complete course was percussion. So he wanted me to study timpani, xylophone, but I didn't want to. I was ready to try and sit down at a set of drums and play at 13 years old.
For the first 2 years of high school, Jimmy studied auto mechanics, but quickly realized that it was not the right career path for him. He then switched to a music major at the high school for 1.5 years, only to drop out in 1954 at the age of 17 to pursue the drums as a professional.
My mother finally said, well, he likes that music, he might as well go talk to his father. And they sent me to see my father. And he was playing with a rhythm and blues quartet. And that was actually what started me. That, and then shortly thereafter, meeting the Zito brothers, introduced me to the top shelf local professional guys.
I heard about Jimmy at the time. Let's see, I was probably 16 or something. And I heard about Jimmy, and we invited him over to the house to play. I had my drums set up, and he played, and I was knocked out. You know, I said, wow, you know, what a beautiful drummer, you know. And I had never heard anyone else in the area play like that. I mean, there were only two of us in the area, you know, at the time. There were only two jazz drummers, you know. Nobody else could play, I guess. I don't know. Because it was like a kind of a depressed area up there, you know. There were people that we would go check out, like J.R. Montrose, Sam Mancuso, Sal Amico, Ernie Washington, Gordon Smith, Sal Nesco, of course, you know. And that they were the people that we wanted to listen to and play with.
Having met these older guys, they introduced me to other musicians from Syracuse, New York, which was 50 miles away from Utica, which at that time, of slow cars that didn't go any faster than 60, and 2-lane roads before the turnpikes and interstates, was a world away. But I started, once I went there and met some of the local musicians, including Scott LaFaro and I were the same age. And he lived in Geneva, New York. I don't know, 75 miles, the opposite direction from Syracuse. And we played every weekend, and I'd spend my whole weekends in Syracuse. I met other musicians after that who hired me. I played in Buffalo, New York, and in Rochester, New York, and met other musicians there. Joe Romano, Sam Noto, and it's sort of like a family, upstate New York musicians, all the way from Albany all the way to Buffalo. We're called the upstate guys. A lot of really famous ones, Mel Lewis, Frankie Dunlop, so many. I can't think off the top of my head, but they're all in the Jazz Encyclopedia, I guarantee you that.
In 1956, Jimmy was asked to join a Dixieland group called the Catatonic Five, which was made up of Hamilton College players. Even though he wasn't a student at the college, Jimmy was able to travel abroad with the group in a program offered through Hamilton College and the Holland America Cruise Line, on which they would play for the passengers in return for their passage to and from Holland.
The name of the band was the Catatonic Five. And none of them became professionals, but a couple of them became lifelong friends. We just played on the ship. There were these, some kind of student organization sponsored sailings, not actually cruises, just crosses of the ocean crossings. Then the students who went on these cruises were left to their own devices to travel around Europe for the summer and then return on a return cruise at the end of the summer. And then the following summer, one of the college students who led a Dixieland band, who I also worked with, called me and said that he was offered, that he had gone the same summer, unbeknownst to me, and that he was offered the chance to do it again, but that he couldn't, and would I be interested in taking a band, which would have been the summer of 1957. And I said, yeah. But I didn't hire college guys. I hired Sal Miko and George Braith, Barry Rogers on trombone, and Roland Ashby on piano. I decided to name the band, for promotional reasons, the American Jazz Quintet. Well, that was the beginning of a lifelong friendship with me, with George Braith. He had just graduated from Music and Art High School when I met him.
I always had a band. From the time I was young, I always had a band, and got in union when I was 13. And this band was booked when I was 16, I think 16, up at Cornell University. And we went up to Cornell University, and there was this guy up there raving, "Oh, wow, hey, that's great." And he says, "I'm from Utica." I said, "Wow, oh yeah, what's up there?" So that was Jimmy Wormworth. And I got to, we became good friends. Matter of fact, I went up there one time and met his father, who was a piano player. And he had a gig for me, which was a very important gig in the beginning of my leaving. The day after I left high school, I went to Europe with him.
When I got this job, the first thing I did was make the mistake of hiring these bebop guys instead of hiring some college Dixieland guys. But then, of course, I wouldn't have gotten any work in Europe because nobody wanted to hear some American college guys playing Dixieland. They had Frank Django Reinhardt. They didn't need some American college guys. But bebop guys, they wanted to hear. Playing Horace Silver type music. But on the ship, we were a complete failure because all the college kids wanted to hear Dixieland. But we didn't play Dixieland. And the guys in the band wouldn't play Dixieland. But we were really successful all over Europe. I set up work for us through the contacts I had made the previous year. Although some of our work just came by us being these young Americans in Holland, in the big city, the capital, The Hague. People approach us on the street, and we ended up having our picture on the front page of a Dutch newspaper and an explanation of who we were, and we were invited to be on Dutch television. And through that, we were contacted by the promoters of this Dutch variety touring show, which we did for almost a whole month. We purchased a used car. It was an East German EMW. And it was the stereotype of what people think about communism society. It broke down everywhere we went. Fortunately or unfortunately, Barry Rogers, the trombone player, knew a little bit about cars and how to work on them. So it was unfortunate because he had the funkiest, greasiest uniform in the band because the car often broke down on a trip. And either Barry fixed it or we'd sleep on the highway at night.
Barry was a mechanic, so he was always underneath the car and doing different things. So one time we was in Holland, driving along, there's water all over the place, and it was pouring rain, and Barry had his hand outside the window moving the windshield wiper as we was driving, and that was very funny.
And it's amazing. We had drums, trumpet, saxophone, trombone, and luggage, all packed into this EMW, which it didn't look big enough. It was big enough outside, Inside, it wasn't too big. I don't know how we fit all that stuff in there, but we did. And we traveled all over Holland and to Paris and back. While we were in Paris, we had to go to Holland to open for J.J. Johnson at the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam. And that's where we met Elvin Jones, Tommy Flanagan, and Wilbur Little. And J.J. Johnson. They were in J.J.'s band at the time. And Elvin and I became pretty close eventually.
We did a concert to bring on J.J. at the Concertgebouw. J.J. Johnson's band was the main attraction, but they had us play first to bring him on. So before we went on, we went. A bunch of us went and sat in the car to see Elvin Jones, who was in J.J.'s band at that time, myself, and I think Jimmy was there. Anyway, I got behind the wheel because we were right in front of a canal. They have a lot of all these canals in Holland. So we were sitting in the car, talking a bunch of stuff and all of a sudden the car started rolling, and the canal was right in front of us. So I hit the brakes, and there was no brakes. And the car kept rolling. I was pressing, and and this car had suicide doors. Like the doors open up that way in America. The way they opened the opposite way on that. So that was like, whew, rough one. Everybody. I kept pushing, and it was I guess hydraulic brakes or something. I don't know what kind, but there was nothing unless the motor was running. Those brakes weren't doing anything. We were going into the canal. As soon as we got to the edge, the car stopped. We all eased out little by little, got out there. Whew, that was a close one. Yeah, that would have been a disaster.
And we played for a month at Le Chaki Pêche, which eventually became one of Paris's most notable jazz club. And we'd go after work to the Club Saint-Germain, and we'd sit in with Kenny Clark and Lucky Thompson. And in other words, my band was very successful in Europe, even though we were a complete flop on the ship with the Americans.
After returning from Europe in August, his upstate New York friend Tori Zito got Jimmy a gig in the Catskills for 2 weeks in order to help him fund a move from his mother's house in Utica to New York City. He first stayed in an apartment for 2 weeks with Tori and saxophonist Frank Porowski, but then moved into a YMCA.
Ronnie Zito, the brother of Tori Zito, called me and said, "Man, Tori's got a gig. He wants to bring you. You can come to New York or go to New York, and he'll put you up for a couple of weeks, and then you're on your own."
Well, I just remember him when he came to town and he came over to the pad, and he told us he didn't have a place to stay.
So I felt fairly comfortable, and I had these guys to guide me.
I just remember the jam sessions and playing with Jimmy and how I thought he was such a remarkable drummer.
I can remember jamming with Horace Parlin there and Cedar Walton.
Jimmy was so likable and so outgoing and just a fun guy to be with.
At first, Jimmy did a few pickup gigs, but mostly worked as a messenger for a watch company. Then he got asked to go on the road with vocalist Nellie Lutcher for the next 4 months.
And I was thrilled. That was my first really big-time job, and I had only been in New York 4 months. I had worked as a messenger at a watch repair business in the Diamond District, and I was so happy to leave that place and go back to playing music, especially with one of my heroes, Nellie Lutcher. Playing with Nellie was a complete pleasure. Her music I loved. She had a great beat. She led us really easy. The job was easy. I had a great technique, so playing fast, slow, nothing was a problem for me. And I knew most of her music because I'd studied it since I was 9 years old. And I was 20 at the time when I got the job with Nellie. And she was completely gracious, very dignified, but with a great sense of humor too. And her business was completely on the up and up with us, her employees, the bassist and the drummer. All our taxes were taken out, and it was like working for a corporation. It was fantastic. Only thing was, Nellie didn't like to fly, and we traveled some long distances. So she and her maid, her secretary, had a Pullman, a sleeper. But Morris and I, we had to coach it. And it was not fun. I'm not much for sleeping sitting up, so. But we traveled a lot out west in some of the great trains, the Chief and Santa Fe, and all the other lines, the Burlington Zephyr, and I got to see a lot of the West. It was pretty beautiful from a dome car. So that was the upside of traveling around with Nellie. And that was pretty much it. And the tour ended here in New York.
After returning from his tour, Jimmy then moved into an apartment on 113th Street in Broadway. Sarah, his soon-to-be wife, who was pregnant with their first child, moved down from Syracuse to be with him. The two were married, and soon after their daughter Tracy was born.
Well, she was a pretty conventional girl. And she, at that time, not that many black folks in the North at least, had an opportunity to go to college. And a lot of people didn't graduate high school, but she did, so that was something of an accomplishment. And she was one of the first African-American telephone operators in Syracuse, New York. And when she moved here, she transferred, and she worked as a telephone operator here. And it was a lot different from Syracuse, according to her.
Jimmy started going to jam sessions and was beginning to become noticed and hired by local players. Since he didn't have a local 802 Musicians Union card yet, he couldn't work in New York City on any job that was more than 2 nights in a row, which at that time was hard to come by. Most jobs were union jobs and were extended engagements that lasted at least a week long in a club. Jimmy was offered the chance to work with saxophonist Charlie Rouse. When Charlie heard that Jimmy wasn't a union member, calls were made, strings were pulled, and soon after, the young drummer received his local 802 union card. From there, Jimmy started working around New York and traveling with groups like Lou Donaldson, Les Jazzmodes, and Phineas Newborn.
Well, after Nellie Lutcher, the second star, as it were, who asked me to work with them was Charlie Rouse. And so with Charlie Rouse, we did different concerts, and we played at the Newport Festival. Playing with Phineas Newborn, I remember the beat was so easy. It was just so easy to play, it seemed like. Doug Watkins and Phineas, their beat together was was real easy for me to collaborate with, to mesh with. Well, playing with Lou Donaldson was the greatest. He was like a father to me. A really good guide. He gave me good guidance.
Well, way back when, I met Jimmy in the Village, down at the Village clubs, and we got a group together. First group I ever had. Jimmy Wormworth, great drummer. We had a ball because he was young, I was young, everybody in the band was young, so we had a ball, talking to the ladies.
And it was through Lou Donaldson that I met Peck Morrison, the bassist. And Peck liked me a lot. And he got me jobs with Mel Waldron. And Mel Waldron became the leader of the house rhythm section. And that's how I was part of that rhythm section. I first worked some concerts with Mel and Peck, and with Kenny Dorham, with Gigi Grice, and another one, maybe, I don't remember with who, maybe Art Farmer. But then he got the job in the 5-spot, and that was January of '59. Well, while I was working at the 5 Spot, Charlie Mingus used to come in there all the time. And I never said anything to him, and he never said anything to me. And his drummer, regular drummer, was Danny Richmond. But Mingus gave everybody such a hard time, even Danny, that Danny would quit, or Mingus would fire him, and then he'd hire Danny back 2 weeks later when he didn't like whoever he got to sub. So one weekend, Mingus asked me to work with him in a club on the Upper East Side called the Black Pearl, which came and went pretty fast, I think, as far as the jazz policy. And so I did the gig, and all the guys in the band, except for Jimmy Knepper, were actually good friends of mine. Shafi Hadi, Horace Parlin, we were pretty close friends. All I remember about the whole gig was the music was beyond me. And at one point on the second night, Mingus, who always stood in front of his bands playing bass, turned around in the middle of something we were playing that was sort of frantic and kicked my bass drum and shouted at me, "Louder!" I was so startled I stopped altogether. Anyway, never worked with him again, I'm glad to say.
The next group to hire Jimmy was quickly making history in the world of jazz. A vocal trio that composed and sang lyrics to instrumental jazz hits of the day, from Count Basie to John Coltrane, and incorporated innovative scat solos. The group? Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross.
I was recommended to this new vocal group, which was a big hit already. I had seen them at the Apollo, in fact. I went to see them. I wanted to see who this group was. That was getting so much airplay and all that. Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross. And my friend Gilda Mahonis, who I had played with Charlie Ross with Les Jazz Modes, recommended me. And, well, to make a long story short, they accepted me. And I don't think there was much of an audition, if there was any kind of audition. And right away, we went to California and played at the Monterey Festival. And then I worked with them for the next 2 years.
Well, in the first place, we used to call him the kid because he looked about 19. But he was married and had a small child. They just had a child. But he always looked like a kid. Even to the last time I saw him, he still had that childish look about him. Yeah, but he was just one of the greatest drummers ever, too, you know.
You know, I can't remember when I met Jimmy Wormworth. It just seems like we had always been together, music-wise. And I love the way he plays.
He never asked you any questions. You had to wait to ask him a few, but he never had a question. He knew how everything went. Because he played so well. And he played everything you needed, you know. Whatever you wanted, he had it.
Full of enthusiasm, ready to experiment, listening. Sweet smile. He was just lovely.
He was a very serious man. He had fun, you know, but he wasn't. He was far from laughing all the time.
I love Jimmy to bits. I think he's great as a musician and a human being. And it's a wonderful relationship because music is forever.
He was so cute. He's such a cute little guy. Everybody loved him. And he was an incredible drummer. Nobody like him.
I played on several of their recordings. The hottest new group in jazz, Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross sing Ellington, High Flying with LH&R. Ike Isaacs, the bassist, was the leader of the trio, which included me and Gilda Mahonas on piano. We performed all over the U.S. in jazz clubs, concert halls, festivals, on television. Although Dave, John, and Annie traveled by plane, the trio, Ike, Gildo, and I, we mostly traveled separately in a station wagon, packed full of all the equipment. We spent a lot of time in there, slept in there, and I can remember I didn't have a driver's license, but we were driving on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and I got tired of driving. I said, let me drive. I almost got us run off the road by a big greyhound. Bus, that is, not the actual dog. Well, we became like a family. I still think of Annie as my big sister I never had. And I feel real fortunate that I had that experience.
During his time on the road with Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross, Jimmy was constantly crossing paths with other top jazz groups. With his camera, he started capturing musicians in the most casual of settings.
Well, I had a Brownie camera. I don't remember why, how, what. Everybody took pictures, just like now. Even, well, not as much as now, but everybody had a camera, and it was usually just a Brownie. And you put the film in, it was a roll, and so forth and so on. And I just carried it around with me. I took a few pictures of my daughter when she was a baby. And occasionally a couple of friends would come over and I'd take pictures of them, Booker Irvin, for example. But I didn't really start taking pictures until I started going on the road. And I guess I carried the camera with me. It was just a simple Brownie, and I'd occasionally take pictures. I don't even remember wanting to do it or anything. The pictures are the only proof to me that I actually did it. So I didn't try to take pictures of the club we were working in, or I didn't try to take street scenes. I wasn't artistic in it or anything at all. It was just like, hey, we're hanging out here, let's take a picture. And that's how a lot of my photographs came about. But I don't remember making it was a big deal or anything in my life. And I don't remember being interested in photography either.
Despite his simple intentions with photography, Jimmy was candidly capturing a very important period of jazz and some of its legendary players. The following photographs are displayed as a slideshow with narration by the photographer himself.
This is Dave Lambert, right before we're getting ready to go and perform. And it's in the Douglas Hotel, which was upstairs from the Showboat Jazz Club in Philadelphia. You can see Dave has on his bow tie and suspenders, which he used to wear with his tuxedo. And that's John's arm. And Dave's writing arrangement, I don't remember what piece it was, but it's for our next recording, I can tell you that. That's John disembarking from a plane in Portland, Oregon at the airport, obviously, and we just arrived on a one-nighter. We were on a short tour with Lenny Bruce and Terry Gibbs and Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross. That's Annie and her son, Kenny Clark Jr., 10 years old at the time, when we were playing in Pittsburgh. And he lived in Pittsburgh with Kenny Clark's brother and sister-in-law. They raised him, more or less. And they used to come to see us every time we went to Pittsburgh. Ike Isaacs was quite a ladies' man. And I don't remember where I took this picture, maybe in Philadelphia. But I think that woman is a perfect illustration of how and why he was a ladies' man. She was one of many. This is John Hendricks sitting at my drums in a TV studio. before the program was ready to be recorded or broadcast or whatever. And John used to like to sit down on my drums and fool around with them. This is Dave doing the same thing. I guess maybe he couldn't be outdone by John, so he used to sit down and fool around my drums too, but not that often. And I decided I would take a picture of both of them. That's John in the dressing room. I'm not so sure he'd be happy about me taking that picture. I'm sure he doesn't even remember it. Maybe he doesn't even remember me taking it. But that I just wanted to bring a star down to earth and show you the real John. This photo is from a tour we did, a package tour called Jazz for Moderns. And that's John Hendricks and Eugene Wright, the bassist from Chicago, who at the time was the bassist with Dave Brubeck, who was one of the artists on the tour. This is another picture of John and Gene Wright. That's the late great pianist and arranger Jackie Byard. He was the pianist with Maynard Ferguson's band when we were part of the package tour Jazz for Moderns. This is a picture taken in the Philadelphia Academy of Music, and that's Chico Hamilton's band at the time. I think that was maybe Ron Carter's first job with a name group, and that's Eric Dolphy playing the bass clarinet. And I think that may have been his first big name job on the East Coast. I took this photo on the last stop on the Jazz for Moderns tour, and it was at the Philadelphia Academy of Music. And that's the vocalist Chris Connor, backed by Al Levitt on drums, Jimmy Rouser on the bass, and Bill Rubenstein on the piano. We were playing at one club in San Francisco, and Cannonball Adderley's quintet was playing in North Beach at the most famous, well-known club at the time, the Jazz Workshop. And his band was Barry Harris, Louis Hayes, Sam Jones, and his brother Nat. And I went over there to see those guys. I guess we might have had a different off night or something. And they just happened to be standing out in the street. And I had bought this Polaroid camera in Washington, D.C., not so long before that. And so I said, "Hey guys, can I take your picture?" And they started clowning, and I took the picture. Showed it to them. They were slightly in awe because Polaroids are pretty new then. One of the times we were in D.C., Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross, that is, I had been there with Lou Donaldson and Babs Gonzalez, and I met a young bassist who was still living at home, hadn't come to New York yet. And for whatever reasons, we became close friends. And it's the bassist, Butch Warren. This is a picture of Butch Warren, his wife Juanita, and my wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Tracy. Both Juanita and Sarah were pregnant at the time. I think Juanita with her first and Sarah with our second. And that's at a playground in D.C. After I'd gotten to know Butch, well, our wives got together. And that was one day when we were hanging out during the day. On one of my visits to Washington, after I had made friends with Butch Warren, he asked me to come to a Sunday afternoon performance of his at a local club with some local guys. At least one of whom became legendary. And that would be the saxophonist on the right in the white jacket, Buck Hill. And it was at a club owned by two brothers named Abe and Arthur, and the club was called Abe Arts. And that's the first time I met a drummer, Billy Hart, the drummer, who at the time was 16 years old. That's Billy Hart, standing next to Butch Warren at Abe Arts. He was 16 years old. I took this photo at a performance space in southeast New Jersey, near Philadelphia. And the bill was Miles Davis and Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross. And that picture was in the dressing room during the day, and Paul Chambers and Ike Isaacs were practicing together. That's Paul on the left, of course, and Ike Isaacs on the right. This is Miles in the dressing room, the same dressing room as Paul Chambers and Ike Isaacs, and at the music tent in southeast Pennsylvania near the New Jersey border. And that's Miles Davis. Not only did I take the previous two pictures of Ike Isaacs and Paul Chambers and Miles Davis in the dressing rooms at the venue in southeast Pennsylvania, but I also took this picture of Paul Chambers and Wynton Kelly before they were getting ready to go on stage. I believe that's Gordon's gin that Paul's drinking. This is the Miles Davis Quintet at the southeast Pennsylvania venue where we shared the bill with them. And that's Paul Chambers at the bass and Jimmy Cobb playing my drums. And Wynton Kelly on the piano. And I can't remember if that was the same night that Paul was drinking the Gordon's gin before he went on stage, or for that matter, if he did it every night. All I know is it didn't seem to affect his playing at all. At the time, Hank Mobley, I believe, was Miles' regular saxophonist. But for whatever reasons, he wasn't on this engagement. The great altoist and tenorist Sonny Stitt was. I don't know how much longer that lasted, but I think not very long. I think Sonny was just a sub. While we were in Pennsylvania at that venue, at the southeast Pennsylvania, for 2 weeks, and on our day off, Paul Chambers wanted to drive back to New York to go home for the day off, and he invited Ike Isaacs and me to go with him, and we did. And then we met him outside the Colony record shop on Broadway at 52nd Street, across the street from Birdland. And he asked me to take a picture of him with his new car, which was a French car, Simca, and I did. And this is after we were in the car on the way back to Philly at a red light, and we were stopped, and I called Paul's name, and he turned around, and I took the picture. That's a picture I took at the Saugatuck Jazz Festival in northern Michigan, and that was at night, and that's Duke Ellington's band with Jimmy Rushing singing in front of the band. And that's the classic saxophone section. Johnny Hodges, Jimmy Hamilton, Paul Gonsalves, and I don't believe you can see the whole saxophone section, and that's Aaron Bell playing the bass. That's Sam Woodyard and Duke Ellington's trumpet section at the Saugatuck Jazz Festival in Michigan. I took this picture in the doorway, the entrance to the Sutherland Hotel in Chicago in 1960. And that's Albert Tootie Heath on the left and Arthur Harper on the right. And they were members at the time of J.J. Johnson's quintet, which included Clifford Jordan and Cedar Walton. I took this photo at the Brooklyn Paramount, and in that photo was in a dressing room with John Hendricks, Dave Lambert, the great jazz vocalist Joe Carroll, and the pianist Joe Zawinul with his back to the camera. This picture is at the stage door of the Brooklyn Paramount, and that's Joe Zawinul and Lex Humphreys, left to right, who was playing with the new group known as the Jazz Tet. And that's a drummer from Philadelphia named Eddie Marshall, who never actually moved here. He was just here visiting that particular day. And that's the great trombonist Curtis Fuller, who is one of the co-founders of the Jazz Tet. And obviously all of us weren't on stage at the time. We were just sitting, hanging out. This is also the Brooklyn Paramount outside. That's Gilda Mahonis on the left, Lex Humphreys in the middle, and Curtis Fuller on the right. Curtis Fuller and Lex Humphreys were part of the jazz set. This is the jazz set taken from the wings at the Brooklyn Paramount. That's Curtis Fuller on the trombone, Lex Humphreys on the drums, Addison Farmer at the bass, Benny Golson on the saxophone, and Art Farmer on the trumpet. Hidden behind all those guys, this young pianist making his debut in New York, McCoy Tyner. That's a picture I took in a dressing room at the Brooklyn Paramount with Dave Lambert and the drummer Lex Humphreys sitting facing the dressing table mirror. And I was standing in back of him and took that picture. This is also in the dressing room, one of the dressing rooms of the Brooklyn Paramount. And left to right, that's Joe Carroll, the great jazz singer, who was just visiting. He wasn't performing with anybody on that engagement. And to his left is the bassist Jimmy Rouser from Philadelphia. And he and the remaining two guys, Joe Zawinul and Al Jones, made up Dinah Washington's rhythm section, who was one of the featured acts on this 2-week show. And there's Miss Dinah herself with her two sons. At that particular appearance, she not only did a duet with the vocalist Brooke Benton, who was a very popular pop singer at that time, and who had made some highly successful recordings with Dinah. She also had her two sons do a soft shoe routine with her on stage, and that's why they're dressed as they are with the straw hat. They carried canes, and the three of them did a soft shoe routine. This is Dizzy Gillespie with his back to the camera, John Hendricks, and Ike Isaacs. And we're in a locker room at the old Madison Square Garden, which was on 50th Street and 8th Avenue. And we were there to perform at the New York Daily News Jazz Festival. There were jazz festivals by everybody then, by Ronzoni Macaroni Jazz Festival. And they're smoking a joint. This is another photo from the Daily News Jazz Festival at Madison Square Garden in the dressing room. And that is left to right Junior Mance, Leo Wright, who was Dizzy's saxophonist at the time, Dizzy's road worker, assistant, John Hendricks, and the late great drummer Teddy Stewart, who was reunited with Dizzy at the time. I took this photo at the Daily News Jazz Festival also, and it was in one of the locker rooms at the old Madison Square Garden. And that's Leo Wright in the foreground, John Hendricks to his left, and Dizzy Gillespie bending over. And that's Jim Hendricks in the light-colored suit above Dizzy, and that's Junior Mance to the right. And I believe they were rolling joints. As I said, there were all kinds of jazz festivals. And Atlantic City, the city had its own jazz festival. It wasn't outdoors, though. It was in a huge theater. And I was standing on the second floor, looking down, and standing having a conversation where left to right, Frank West, facing him, the bassist Gene Taylor, to Gene's left, the great vocalist Joe Williams, and facing Joe, John Hendricks' brother, Jim Hendricks. This picture was also at the Atlantic City Jazz Festival. Left to right, Ron Albright, Richard Davis, and the great Sarah Vaughan. And those are my drums, by the way. This is another picture I took in Atlantic City in a dressing room, and that's Ike Isaacs on the left and Sam Jones on the right. We occasionally worked in the Apollo, and this is on 126th Street outside the stage door. And those are two drummers. The left is G.T. Hogan from Texas, who lived here a long time but then went back to Texas, and the late great Vernel Fournier, who was appearing at the Apollo with Ahmed Jamal. This is a photo I took from the wings in the Apollo of the Ahmed Jamal trio. In the foreground, Vernel Fournier. On the bass, Israel Crosby, and of course, Ahmed. We once worked at the Howard Theatre in Washington, D.C., and one of the groups on the show was Philly Joe Jones Quintet. And Bill Barron and Jimmy Garrison were two of the members of that quintet. And I took this picture in their room across the street from the theater in between shows. This is a Philly Joe Jones Quintet at the Howard Theatre in Washington, D.C., with Jimmy Garrison at the bass, Bill Barron on saxophone, Michael Downs playing trumpet, and out of the picture, Walter Davis Jr. at the piano. That's Bill Dowdy, the drummer, and Andy Simpkins, the bassist, from the trio, The Three Sounds, which was a very popular trio with some records that were played pretty universally. And that was at the Howard Theatre in Washington, D.C. also. One of the times we visited Washington, we were at the Howard Theatre, which was the Washington version of the Apollo. And it was a package show, a jazz show. And Sonny Stitt was one of the performers. And shortly before I took this picture, I had purchased this camera, a Polaroid, from someone backstage. And that was the first picture I took with the camera of Sonny Stitt sitting in the dressing room. And unfortunately, at that time, Polaroid film had to be developed by the user. You pulled the film out of the camera, you waited till it developed, and then you peeled off the packaging. And if you waited too long, it came out extremely dark. And if you didn't wait long enough, it came out extremely light, washed out. And since I didn't know anything about the camera, I just took the picture, waited a few minutes, and then peeled it and showed it to Sonny Stitt. He wasn't too happy because he said to me, "Are you trying to make me look darker than I already am?" One time when I was in Detroit with Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross, I usually stayed at a black hotel called the La Touraine. And one day I walked out of my hotel, and who do I see but my old friends and one of my mentors, Lou Donaldson, Horace Parlin, and Al Harewood. And I have no recollection where they were playing, but apparently they were playing in town the same time I was. It was shortly after that I ran into Lou Donaldson outside my hotel again, and he was with Coleman Hawkins. And I just had to take a picture of them. I'm sure I didn't go back into my hotel room to get my camera. I'm sure I had it with me. But I'm so glad I took that picture. I love the way Lou Donaldson is looking at Coleman Hawkins. On one of our visits to D.C., we played at the Barron Amphitheatre, and it was a triple bill with Ella Fitzgerald and Oscar Peterson, besides Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross. And I believe that picture was taken backstage. Ray Brown was working with either one of those groups. I can't remember which one. I think it was Oscar Peterson. And that's Gilda Mahonis talking to him. That's Oscar Peterson at the Barron Amphitheatre in Washington, D.C. And that's Ed Thigpen at the drums and Ray Brown at the bass. And I had the Polaroid camera, and it didn't have a zoom lens or anything, and I didn't even know about zoom lenses then anyway. So that's the best I could do with them. This photo is one I took of Ray Brown and Herb Ellis. Herb Ellis was working with Ella Fitzgerald. She had a quartet rhythm section. And it was at that same venue, the Carter Barron Amphitheatre in Washington, D.C. I took this photo in the dressing room of the Carter Barron Amphitheatre, and that's Gus Johnson, the drummer in the foreground, who was working with Ella Fitzgerald, and Herb Ellis behind him. And the other person in that photo is a French journalist, I believe, who was interviewing them. This is another photo I took at the Carter Barron Amphitheatre in Washington, D.C., and that's Ella Fitzgerald with Herb Ellis, Paul Smith at the piano, Gus Johnson at the drums, and I don't remember who the bass was. Could be Ray Brown played with both groups. I took this photo at a party after hours at the basement of someone's house in Washington after performing at the Carter Barron Amphitheatre. And that's the Washington drummer Bertel Knox, Ed Thigpen with his back to the camera and with Ray Brown's arm around his shoulder. And that's Ray Brown on the right. I took this picture on a rest stop on the New Jersey Turnpike. We had just left New York to go to who knows where, and we made a stop shortly after we got across the river to New Jersey. And who did we run into but the bassist and drummer with Ahmed Jamal, the great Israel Crosby, who's on the left in the black shirt, and Vernel Fournier, the great drummer, who's in the middle with the beret. And the guy on the right is John Hendricks' brother, Jim Hendricks, who was our road manager. This photo, I have no idea where it was, but I can tell you who that is. That's John Hendricks and Randy Weston. And I think, judging by what John is wearing, that was shortly before we were to perform or shortly after. I took this photo in the Village Vanguard. That's in the hallway in between the kitchen and the main performance room. And that's John Hendricks on the left, Leonard Feather in the center, Roy Haynes to his left, and Gilda Mohonis to Roy Haynes' left.
In 1961, Jimmy left Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross in order to spend more time with his family. His gigs were now local freelance jobs and a few extended engagements. By 1965, he and Sarah were actively raising all 5 of their children in an apartment in Brooklyn. Due to the financial pressures of raising a large family, Jimmy was forced to get a day job.
We wanted to collect public assistance, and they sent me to various offices. I said I was a professional, but in their minds I wasn't, apparently. And I was sent by some counselor to a job with the Social Security Administration in their regional payment center. Well, processed a lot of claims, and I filed folders all day, and it wasn't fun. I stayed there for 3 years, unfortunately, and by the time the 3rd year came around, we still didn't make enough money. A federal civil service worker, at least at that level, didn't make much money. And even though I'd gotten small raises within the 3 years, I still qualified for supplemental welfare. And curiously enough, the caseworker who came to our house while I was at work was a fan of Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross, and couldn't believe that I needed welfare. But I guess that's the way things go.
The Virgin Mary had a baby.
The next job to bring Jimmy back to music was not with a jazz artist this time, but a popular folk singer, Chad Mitchell.
Chad had been the leader, or at least the front man, for a folk trio. And apparently he became convinced, or somebody convinced him, that he was ripe for a solo career as a pop singer. And so he got some musicians from New York, including the pianist and vocalist and lyricist Bob Dorrell, who I knew from the late 50s when both of us first arrived in New York. Well, I decided to quit my day job. I made more money in 1 week with Chad Mitchell than I made in the whole month, literally, with the federal government, the Social Security Administration. Playing with Chad was a job, not, it was a job that you did to make a living. It wasn't any kind of music that I was interested in. I played it all right, but it just was a job.
In 1969, Jimmy got hired by the great jazz pianist Al Haig and played a series of performances and recorded 3 albums with him.
In 1969, my dear friend and sometime benefactor, Arthur Edgehill, the great drummer, told me that he was in the process of recording an album with Al Haig, and that he wasn't very happy doing it, I don't think. Arthur referred me to Al for just single engagements, and Al called me, and I met him at Bridge Plaza in Brooklyn, at the foot of the Williamsburg Bridge. And he had a Volkswagen Beetle convertible, and it was January, and he informed me as soon as I had packed my drums into the Beetle with the bass that he was sorry, but he had no heat. And anyway, that was the start of a really long and treasured association with Al, at least treasured by me.
In 1970, Jimmy and Sarah separated, and the children moved back upstate with her to Utica. For the next 25 years, Jimmy fell out of the jazz scene and was mostly playing club dates and bar mitzvahs.
I was lucky enough to join an organization called the Club Date Office in New York terms. I think in LA they're called Casuals, but which already had some excellent musicians who I knew, and subsequently used a few more very talented, well-known musicians in New York. So while it was boring music, it was lucrative, and the musicians I worked with were enjoyable to work with. And I did that for almost 20 years. I was able to own a car and so forth, live a middle-class life for quite a while. I guess around 1990, DJs started playing for all kinds of functions, well, no matter where the functions were, even in places like the Waldorf or the Plaza. And gradually, live music was phased out. And that's what happened to my career as a club date musician. Luckily, that's when I started playing jazz, around 1995, full-time again, thanks to the great saxophonist Charles Davis.
Well, I first met Jimmy when I came to New York back in the 50s. I was working with a drummer named Arthur Edgehill. He was a friend of Jimmy's, so that's how I met him. Anyway, I heard him and I gave him a compliment. When you give him a compliment, sometimes he's reluctant to accept it for what it's worth.
He took a liking to me, and I loved playing with him. His style is really distinctive. He's very creative, highly musical, with great history in the music that he lived, history that he lived. And it wasn't until 1995 that a mutual acquaintance of ours, a trumpet player from my hometown, who happened to be in my American Jazz Quintet, had a niece who owned a club in Utica, and she was a jazz fan and had performances regularly. And this friend invited me to go play in Utica with Charles Davis and himself and my friend, the trumpeter.
Yeah, we were working a gig up in Utica. I think it was Sal Amico was responsible for that. I think Joe Magnarelli was on the gig, and myself and Jimmy and a few guys from Utica. It was maybe somebody else. I don't remember. But I started playing with him. It felt very comfortable, working with him. I said, oh yeah, okay. I like that, so I started hiring him after that.
And right from then, Charles and I were hooked back up again. As soon as we finished playing first set, we took a break. Charles told me he had some work for me in New York. And we've been close ever since. Closer than ever, I guess.
Through his connection with Charles Davis, Jimmy then became connected with other jazz musicians who began using him in their groups.
I knew Jimmy for several years before I learned about half the people he played with. Like, we would be in the car and we'd go into the gig. He's overly humble. It's ridiculous. I mean, I know music is a humbling thing to us, but he's so humble. And I would be in the car with him, and he'd say, oh yeah, that time I was with Phineas and Doug. And I'd be like, well, there's only one Phineas and Doug. It's not, it's not a comedy tangent. Like, or found out he played with Tran, he played with Wes, he played with Kenny Dorham, and he wouldn't even drop the names. I mean, everybody else, would drop those names. They'd be acting like that was them, that they were, Jimmy, I mean, you got to pull it out of him. And then he'll talk about it. He's happy to talk about it. But to him, he's just a normal guy who happened to be a lot of places, and he seems too young to have been in those places. But he's been there. Jimmy's amazing. You can't find a Jimmy Wormworth. I mean, he's enough reason to live in New York. He's always in flux. He's always full of surprises, and he's got great musical ideas, and he just erupts with them all the time.
It was swinging. Such a stomping and shoving till the break of dawn. Well, they took it today.
Another thing my good friend Tardo did for me was to reunite me with Annie Ross back in 2004, I believe, and I've been working with her ever since. Made a beautiful recording with her, which I'm very proud of, and hopefully she is too. I think she is. And I made new friends. Her bassist Neal Miner, who's one of the young Smalls guys, and he's growing out of Smalls now. He's on to bigger and better things. And the trumpeter Warren Bechet, who I had heard of for a long time, but I don't believe I had ever met. And we're just like a little family. And it's such a pleasure to play with Annie every week. She knows so much about the music. If you can, search out the documentary about her. No one but me. We're all in it.
Such dog to break it down.
My friend Tardo is fascinated by my seeming obsession with matching socks with tie, and shirt, or suit. So every week at Andy's gig, I have to do a demonstration of how great my sartorial coordination is. Wait till he sees what I have tonight. Wait till he gets a load of that.
It was rock. It was swinging. You never see such stuff in a shop until the break it down. It was rocking. It was swinging.
Yeah, Jimmy, he's quite a rare talent. I honestly miss drummers like Jimmy. I mean, aside from the fact of his rare talent, above all, he plays with great taste. He's irreplaceable for me.
Not only has Jimmy led a highly interesting life, he has also brought 5 successful children into this world.
Well, when I was a young guy, before I took the wrong fork in the road and ended up being a father when I was still a kid, the only thing I wanted out of life was to play with the guys whose music I love, and to have a Ferrari and a steady stream of pretty faces. Instead, I got a steady stream of 5 kids who all have pretty faces, and all are lucky for me to be really talented. And they're kind of lucky too. They were born into a world, their personal world, that is to say, that's pretty unusual. They lived in the poorest neighborhood in Brooklyn, but had family who were well off and took care of them. And they've been more successful than I have been, I'm happy to say. And they did a lot on their own. And I mainly wanted one thing for them, to not turn out like me, to be spoiled rotten, to be able to work hard and think of that as just something you do and not think of it as something you have to do. And fortunately, that got ingrained in them. They got conditioned to thinking like that, and they all work hard, and they all have been very successful and have been in positions to meet some very powerful, influential, famous people, and to work with them, and to travel the world. And they did it all on their own. And that goes for all 5 of them. I don't even have to mention each one by name, because they're a group, and they stick up for each other. And I think a parent couldn't ask for anything more than to have kids like I have. Like I told my friend Tyler when he told me, "Man, you have such great kids." I said, "Look, man, my kids are great in spite of me, not because of me." And boy, am I relieved.
Anything that we think we're doing is on the backs of Jimmy Wormworth and other like-minded musicians that were there and are continuing to be here today.
He plays things that I never saw any other drummer do, or just really idiosyncratic things. He plays brushes, and he's right-handed, but he plays leading with his left hand. And you ask him why, he says, "I don't know."
I really like the way he plays behind the soloist, like comping, and it means he really listens to the music and he tried to answer their solo, and then that makes music really happening.
He's one of real rare guys that are still around that play that kind of music, plays with the real roots where all that origin comes from.
Yeah, drummers are like arrangers, just like every instrument is, but you know, the drums is as well, you know, it has just as many nuances and dynamics and things of that nature, and ways to make everybody sound better, you know. And he's definitely perfected that, you know, in terms of, and also like a certain type of propulsion that he has that, you know, isn't common among any musician necessarily, but he has that, you know, that kind of thing that's like, you know, it's like a direct path.
You know, so he brings a feeling to the music that a lot of people of younger generations didn't really get to experience firsthand.
So Wormworth is a gem to me, because he was there, he saw it, he's heard it. And when you hear him play, there's a certain understanding that guys that have been around for a while have with the instrument, you know.
the adventure of hearing him. It's different every time.
He's always helpful to anybody, like younger musicians ask him about the music, then he talks about the music, and just talking with him is a great lesson to me.
He's the treasure, man. He's the history.
He's got a fun-loving quality about him.
You know, he's just got a positive energy that I really love and really cherish.
I would say the best experience I've had about being in New York is knowing Jimmy, and the one I'll remember the most from my whole life, I think.
Since 1970, Jimmy has lived in the Jupiter Court Apartments in Rego Park, Queens. He raised his children there, but for many years had been living alone. In 2009, while on tour in Germany, he met Faith Gibson. The two became romantically involved, and most recently, Faith has moved to the U.S. to live with Jimmy.
So I went to hear the John Marshall Quintet, right?
Yep.
At the Schmiede in Düsseldorf. And as always, I took my camera along and took pictures. And I later posted the pictures on Facebook. Yeah, so I posted these pictures. He was touched or tickled by that and made a comment on Facebook, and we became Facebook friends. And every once in a while after that...
And then we got even more serious.
We got more serious. So I came here.
Right.
After countless visits.
Yeah.
Between 2010 and 2013.
Right.
I came to New York, I don't know, 5 or 6 times. Brought him to Europe 3 or 4 times.
We toured around Europe together. Through her, I met a whole lot of people over there. For the past 4 or 5 years, ever since meeting Faith, I've had the good fortune to do teaching at workshops and clinics in Germany and Austria, and also past couple of years I've been on the faculty at the biggest jazz camp. That's Begues, which is a town on top of a mountain above Barcelona. And I think I'm starting to enjoy teaching more than playing. Well, I was lucky enough to have had great experiences at their ages with the giants of the music, from John Coltrane to almost everybody who was living, even Louis Armstrong. And I guess for anybody who hasn't had the good fortune to have those experiences, they want to know what it's all about from somebody who did. And I'm only happy to relive them and talk to young musicians about them and tell them what I learned from those guys. Well, for the future, I guess I'd like to do more teaching. I'd like to keep playing with Annie Ross. I'd like to play again with the great Charles Davis. I'd like to continue playing with my dear friend and colleague Tardo Hammer. And I'd like to keep up my artistic and personal friendship and relationship with John Marshall, who's from just down the street in Long Island, but lives about 6,000 miles away in Germany. But he comes here, and I work with him when he comes here, and when he can, he brings me there, and actually life is pretty content. I just hope my children keep doing well. My son is a drummer on the Conan O'Brien show, and my oldest daughter is a very successful bassist, and I guess as long as they're happy, it's like Alka-Seltzer for me, relief. My son said, "Dad, we just want to make you happy." I said, "Nico, happiness for me is relief." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "That everything's okay with you, you and your wife aren't divorced, that your sister Tracy isn't bankrupt, she's doing well, and so forth and so on. That's a relief for me and I'm happy." He said, "Oh, I think I get it now, Dad."
we went to Pittsburgh, and they put us in one of these hot sheets motels. You don't know what that is, do you? You don't know what a hot sheet motel is?
No, I don't think so.
That's where you can't stay in the room but a half hour. And the guy's knocking on the door, telling you to get out. Somebody else is coming in.